It is my absolute pleasure to have with me representatives from two of our sponsoring companies here in Corning and Dominion Energy. Our topic for this session is to really explore innovation amongst a number of two established companies here, and that kind of represent different parts of the value chain that maybe what we've talked about so far to date. To my immediate left is Ann Nicholson, who comes from us from Corning, Vice President of Investor Relations. I think I've known Ann now for about a decade.
Yeah.
She's participated in a number of our different sessions we've had with the Batten Institute over the years. And then to her left is Mark Webb, who is the Chief Innovation Officer for Dominion. I've known Mark for probably 30 years now. We spent some time as students here at UVA together. So to kick things off, I actually am going to start with Mark here. Mark, your background is as a lawyer, and so can you tell us a little bit how a lawyer becomes the Chief Innovation Officer for Dominion Energy?
We drew names out of a hat. It probably means I shouldn't have gone to law school. In fairness, I think that it's actually great preparation. I think lawyers, depending on what type of lawyer you are and the nature of your personality, you're generally trying to solve problems, and you're looking for solutions. Whether it's in the way you structure a deal or a financing or making a deal work or something. And I think if you're like that in everything you do, it's a pretty good transition into innovation, because you're constantly looking for, here are the issues, this is the way to fix it, and you look at it analytically and see both sides. And so I think it's an easy transition that way.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that role means at Dominion?
So we began an innovation department about 2 years ago. I assumed the role last year. We're trying to transform the company. For those of you who don't know Dominion Energy, we deliver energy, electricity and natural gas, 18 states. We have 7.5 million customers. So when we innovate, it's not so much that we are creating, we don't have scientists out there researching nuclear fusion. We're taking other people's innovations and applying them. And applied innovation is very critical for companies. We're not alone in terms of that's what we do. We take innovations and apply them. But we've been around for 100 years. We have certain ways of delivering energy that are changing rapidly. And we have a need to serve the public. And so how do you change 20,000 people who have been taught for 100 years that their goal, that their mission and their job is to deliver energy reliably and affordably? And then say, well, by the way, you also need to do it sustainably. And so with that, it's how do we make people think in a different way and come up with, at every stage of their work process, to begin to innovate, to not be afraid to take risks, measured risks. And so it's top to bottom, rethinking the culture and how do we implement programs throughout the organization.
Great, thank you. Now, Ann, maybe a more traditional background, engineering, came to Darden, got your MBA, and now find yourself in investor relations. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and also how your job now relates to the issues at hand here with climate change and the like?
Yeah, sure. So, I came right out of college as an engineer, thought I'd be an engineer for Corning, but quickly realized that I thought I was pretty smart and I wanted to be a leader in the company. So in the traditional manufacturing path in engineering is to be a plant manager. So I had set my sights there, but kind of got diverted a little bit with a boss that said, everybody who works for me has to get a master's degree. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not getting a master's in engineering. So I came to Darden and got my MBA, and really thought that I was going to be a direct influence in a business leadership, but I really got some good coaching along the way around influence and different ways to be influential in the company. And that led me to a couple different jobs where I had influence from the outside, either strategic initiatives or corporate initiatives. And then one day the CFO thought Ann Nicholson would be good in IR because I had 20 years of experience with the company, technical background, so can explain technology to investors. So 10 years later, I'm still in investor relations and considering going to work for Corteva now that Wendy talked to us. But
can you talk a little bit about how, again, these issues of climate change find their way into your kind of day-to-day life?
Yeah, absolutely. The gentleman from JP Morgan said it absolutely right, that assets under management some are very serious about ESG investments. Certainly the move is that way. It's an increasing number of dollars of assets under management that are really focusing on ESG. Yes, I had to get the CDP survey answered.
You didn't get the F. That's good. You actually turned it in.
We turned it in,
Okay, good.
yes, we did. I'm glad I know now that I would have gotten an F. But it's really, so third parties really more than anything right now are pressuring Corning to provide disclosure on what we're doing. And even investors, my traditional investors that don't care about ESG, there's now becoming a person in the room who they're the ESG person that's really becoming more and more interested. So it's just becoming more mainstream, important to pay attention to for the company.
Great. Mark, going back to you, maybe you could start us off talking a little bit about, from Dominion's perspective, some of the challenges and opportunities you're seeing broadly around climate change.
So I think for us, as a company that delivers energy, both electricity and natural gas, we're at the forefront of climate change. I think we look at it from a broader perspective in terms of we look at the whole energy picture. Electricity has dropped its carbon emissions. We're now below transportation. So we look for opportunities in terms of how do you address carbon, not just with what we do, but we look at communities that we serve. And so when we look for opportunities, it's just, if we're delivering electricity that's now a growing amount of carbon-free electricity, does that enable us to do things within those communities that takes another activity and makes it lower carbon? So then it opens the doors to transportation. Other initiatives like that. We look at agriculture. We look at things like vertical agriculture. It's not just replacing carbon in the way things are grown, but it eliminates, again, transportation if you can grow something very close to where it's consumed. We look at what I think transportation in the gas business similarly. When we set a goal that we want to serve our communities and make others, people will use natural gas to heat their homes or to power their industries for the foreseeable future, especially in colder climates. So how do you make that natural gas more sustainable? And so we've focused as an opportunity on renewable natural gas, which is essentially, we formed partnerships with Smithfield, Dairy Farmers Association of America to capture methane that's emitted from animals and inject that into a pipeline system. And then when our customers use natural gas for heat, they will get a percentage of the gas that's renewable natural gas. And the hope is that we can build it in the same way that renewable energy credits came into the forefront on electricity. So we look for any opportunities directly to what we do, and then for those adjacencies. As you begin to change transportation, what's the role for us? As you begin to address industrial emissions, is there a role for us, and if so, what is it? And so we kind of parse the energy sector to go beyond what we traditionally do and say, if we start reaching into these other sectors with our now greener forms of delivering energy, what can we do to reduce carbon?
Definitely want to unpack some of that in a second, but I want to bring Ann back into the conversation. Same question I asked Mark, opportunities and challenges you're seeing at Corning as it relates to climate change.
Yeah, so as an innovation company, for sure, paying attention to all of those areas and where can Corning play. We want to stay true to our material set, so glass, ceramics, optics, but how does that play in energy generation, energy storage? I always say one day we're going to have a battery project that's successful, one day we're going to be in water. So we're looking at those opportunities as new, as real innovation from scratch, but also in the industries that we're in today. So automobiles, for example, same thing, transportation. Emissions regulations are getting tighter. The potential for electrification, and even, we don't have the CAFE standard, but just miles per gallon. How can we be there to help miles per gallon? How can we be there for shared mobility, connected cars, autonomous driving?
Yeah, so let's take a deeper dive into that sector. I believe, and I think we've heard from others, about this notion that we're in the midst of a disruption there with electrification. Has huge implications actually for both your companies. Maybe Mark, you could start us off with how is Dominion thinking about this, especially when I think about the increase in demand for electricity we are likely to see in an electrified vehicle world?
I think in terms of the increase in demand, is actually, at least from the standpoint of Virginia and most of the Southeast, it's a pretty good story in that because we have air conditioning load, and for the most part we also heat electrically in the Southeast, the systems are built to be robust. And so the additional electric load from transportation is not going to require a great deal of additional investment in the infrastructure and in the energy production if you manage the charging correctly.
Is this a timing issue then?
It's a timing issue.
Okay.
But in some ways, because most cars are likely, other than when you're traveling, will charge at home or at night. The key is to make sure that we have the tools and the technologies that if someone goes in and they plug in at home, which you don't have to charge every night, it's depending on your commute, it's every few days, but when you do plug in, that you can control that charge to happen during the middle of the night. And it actually it lets us utilize our assets more efficiently. Because at night, the assets are there to generate electricity. The fact that you can utilize them for another option actually reduces other costs. So the potential is enormous there from that standpoint. So
in many ways, you're incentivized to kind of push towards the electrification of vehicles. You mentioned some initiatives there. Can you just talk a little bit about how those partnerships work, how those conversations work? Because I know you've done some innovative things with public transportation and the like.
We've looked hard at public transportation a lot. We started with school buses. We took that as kind of a case example of electric school buses. They're much more expensive than diesel school buses today, because they're new and not many of them are made. But when you start to look at it, you say the school buses across the country, they're idle 180 days a year or half the year. Generally, they're idle, and those are at known, predictable days when they are not operating. They also, for the most part, park in the same centralized locations at night. Rural counties are a little bit different. Some people take them home at night, the drivers. But generally, they're in the same location. They have a set schedule. So from the standpoint, and they have electric batteries and large electric batteries. So that becomes the potential to use those batteries for a grid resource. So we looked at it and said, if we know where something's going to be, and we know what time it's going to be there, and we know the days that it's going to be there, from the standpoint of the potential to use those batteries under what's vehicle-to-grid applications, it enables us to use those to balance the grid to help address some of the intermittency of renewables. And not just the hourly storage, but even just the variations that can occur on a circuit during the minutes when clouds pass over rooftop solar. And you might have a sag or a drop in voltage. You can use the batteries that are localized to help stabilize those circuits. And then there's the longer-term potential for short-term capacity in terms of that period from 5 to 7 p.m. when solar panel production has decreased, but our load is going up because people are getting home. Long-term, at scale, it has a real potential to help us solve that problem.
Now, for you, Corning is a supplier to the auto industry. If I understand correctly, catalytic converters, is that correct? So obviously in an electrical world, we don't have catalytic converters, so there's some opportunities or risk here of loss, but there's other opportunities as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So if you think about the transition to electrification, for sure, an opportunity for us is as long as there's gas combustion engine in that car, if it's a hybrid, we continue with the catalytic converter. But as you think about improving miles per gallon, moving to electrification, the weight of the car really matters. And so the one opportunity that we are beginning to commercialize is with our Gorilla Glass in automobiles to make that soda lime to soda lime one ply turn into Gorilla, and you lightweight the car and you extend the battery life, which we think is going to be important in electrification. I'm sure you're the better expert, but I know I have range anxiety around making sure I can get to where I want to get without running out of juice. So that's one for sure. That is a near-in opportunity for us.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the Gorilla Glass story for those who aren't entirely familiar with it. Because my understanding is the original development of Gorilla Glass was for automotive back in the 1960s. But maybe tell us a little bit more how we've come back full circle here.
Yeah, right. So we went to car manufacturers in the 60s with a better windshield. And we had invented a new way to make basically a sheet of glass that we thought was, from mass production perspective, going to be better, called the fusion process. And so we knocked on the car makers' doors and said, hey, here's this great new windshield. It's better, it's safer. And they're like, yeah, no, I don't want that. But they did then say, can you help me out with this emissions problem? Because the US just said you have to do something about your noxious gases. And so that's what gave birth to our environmental business. But you fast forward to 2007-ish, and you had Steve Jobs looking to make the first iPhone, and he had one in his pocket, and it had a plastic cover, touch surface, and he pulled it out, and it was scratched after not a long period of time, and he said, this is bad, it has to be glass, and eventually connected with Corning. And we pulled that strengthened windshield glass technology back out of our pocket and refined it, and actually have made Gorilla Glass, I think, 6 times more durable than that very initial invention. So it really is a testament to being best in the world in what we do and continuing to innovate to make it even better.
Wonderful. I want to at this time encourage any of you, if you have questions, to start making your way up to the microphones here. But as we wait for you to do so, another question for both of you. We've heard a lot about digital transformation and its impact and as it relates to climate change. I could imagine it might have impacts for both of your industries as well. So maybe share how you're thinking about that type of transition with our sustainability challenges.
So I think it affects us in 2 ways, or at least 2 ways. First, of course, is the digital transformation is the exponential increase in the use of data, which drives the need for data centers. Data centers consume a significant amount of electricity. So from the need to provide electricity to data centers, that's a big impact. And to do that sustainably, most data center companies are focused on renewable energy, which is good, the Apples, et cetera, but it's a large demand and requires infrastructure to satisfy that need to power the data centers. From the other side, I often tell people that they'll ask me, what do you think the greatest disruptor is that you're facing? And I'll think about it, and they're probably expecting me to say, something like solar shingles or something like that. But I say it's going to be data, because and not necessarily in a bad way, but I think it's going to disrupt the industry, because as you have data and data precision from the locations of where assets are, where people are, where demand is, consumers have access to data in terms of what the price is at a certain time, or what their own usage is. Or where the energy is coming from at a particular moment on a grid, whether it's coming from a natural gas facility or whether it's coming from an offshore wind facility at a time. I think it's going to empower people, it's going to empower us and other players and independent producers. That's going to transform the way we think of the energy grid, because the energy and the ability to operate and make decisions without requiring human action to take an action that might result in a greater efficiency or more efficient use of energy will transform the way we think of the sector over time.
Anne?
And so I'll just piggyback on the data center one. So if you think about all that data moving, access, and storage, for us, we make optical fiber and all the connectivity that goes with it. And just optics versus copper, you could probably have the data better than I do. It uses less energy, so you're transmitting light. It's not generating heat like a copper cable. And we have some packages now that really let you literally densify that space, so your data center footprint is smaller and your heat load is smaller in an optical world. And then just the number of data centers is a good opportunity for us. So it's more data centers and more of our stuff in every data center in the world of optics. We're also beginning some collaborations. We've had a couple of announcements, one with Intel, one with Qualcomm around 5G. And what can you do with 5G in an indoor space? So we're actually in our optical facilities down in Charlotte, looking at how can we have a manufacturing infrastructure where 5G is giving you some efficiencies, process efficiencies, data analysis efficiencies. So those are 2 that come top of mind.
I imagine 5G for you, Mark, in terms of like the Internet of Things, connected devices, smart grid.
All of those things, where it's deployed, how it's rolled out, what assets is it deployed, what assets does it use to deploy, street lights, our assets, and then what the definition of smart city is one of those things that's undefinable. Many definitions, but what does that mean for us long term? Where do we play? What does it mean for data? Again, the concept that you may have data centers in order to really benefit from the reduced latency of the flow of information. The data centers will be smaller but closer to urban areas. So again, it will transform where we're delivering power.
Now, I want to open up to questions, but before I do that, one last question for you both. The regulatory environment, especially Mark with Dominion, the one you operate in, it sounds like we're going to need policy innovation as well and policy evolution to deal with 5G, to deal with smart grid, to deal with some of these opportunities. How does Dominion approach that? How do you think about that policy interface?
So I think that what we try to think about is that we operate in a world of regulated earnings. We have 18 different regulated utilities. Traditionally, it has been an analysis of the cost and benefits within the small confines of the product delivered and the people who are using that product. You begin to look at solutions like the electric school buses, which in addition to providing us with benefits when we own the batteries, when you read data that the air inside a school bus, a diesel bus, is 5 times dirtier than the air outside. So when you replace those with electric school buses, there's an enormous health benefit to school children. So how do you quantify that? And is there a policy that gives that? When we go in for regulatory review, how is that reflected? We've all been waiting for, what will be the form of carbon regulation, which is the easiest one? Is it a price? Is it something else? Often you see legislatures will act outside of the regulatory process and say, we're going to have our own requirements here. And it works. I mean, the legislature has the final decisions, whether it's a state or federal action. But I think that there's a broader view when we begin to look at things. What are the benefits on a broader scale? And how do you account for those when you decide whether you should be able to do a project that benefits the public in terms of delivering energy? It's a fine line. You can't go too far, open the door, but you need to come up with some way that recognizes that there are costs and benefits outside of the narrow scope of the way you deliver energy that impacts society at large, and that has to be reflected in some way in the way we decide on what initiatives to support. And that's where policy comes in.
And I imagine Corning's not quite as regulated as Dominion, but I imagine you have your own regulatory and policy challenges. Same question to you.
Yeah, I think so. We would look at them as opportunities. So, for example, just staying on that clean air quality. It's early days, but just on that, if you're in a big city like Los Angeles, the air coming out of the tailpipe of your car is actually cleaner than the ambient air. So we've taken that idea, and it's an early stage project, but can we just clean air? Take that same technology and just have ambient air run through our stuff and have it come out cleaner. So it's an early day project, but something like that, in particular in big cities where there is a lot of pollution in the air, is there some opportunity in that regard? And just the general tightening of regulations on air emissions is an opportunity for us in the material set. Glass, and particularly engineered glass, can have real advantages in efficiencies in the production of solar panels, for example. Being able to make a glass, we've got another early stage project where you can print. Think about printing electronics on glass. You can't just do that on any glass. You probably have something like Corning's glass that you need to do that on. So basically that, like where are there innovation opportunities, and who are the leaders in those industries? Not necessarily the biggest player in the industry, but who's the innovator in those industries that we can really help enable the solution to a tough technology challenge in any of those areas.
Great. So let's open up to questions.
Hi, Lindsay from Mary Baldwin University. Thank you all for being here today. So Mark, this is especially for you. So I want to commend Dominion Energy for being proactive in things like the public-private partnership that they did with Microsoft and using solar energy to offset that data center. And you guys have mentioned 5G. But something that you're currently facing, of course, is the impacts of climate change and hurricanes and how that can impact your business on a day-to-day operation. So are you guys currently looking at microgrids or other ways that you might be able to serve rural customers, and what kind of business opportunities transitioning from coal and fossil fuels might bring for you?
Several questions. I think, certainly we're looking at resiliency. It's a critical component, and it's at every level. It's both from just in coastal areas, making sure equipment is elevated, making sure that the poles are stronger. We put them closer together so that they will survive wind events. I think that in terms of rural communities, but also we're looking at in terms of resiliency, our ability to respond using data and data analytics to predict when we have certain wind events, which equipment is most likely to fail first. We're building some pretty complicated models to help predict that, and then you can have assets pre-positioned and make sure you have enough inventory. So there's a lot of nuts and bolts that goes like that. In terms of opportunities, I think certainly as we used to be 10 years ago, we were 40% coal. We're now 13 to 12% of production in Virginia. I think we've just acquired a utility in South Carolina, which is embarking on the same sort of transformation over time that we've gone through in Virginia. But I think the opportunities, in current technology, 24/7 natural gas has provided the replacement, and it's caused a significant drop in carbon emissions. We're down 50%. I think we look ahead in terms of there's still going to be a continuing role for natural gas really to support renewables as we grow. We're looking at offshore wind and building we've committed to a very significant 2,600 megawatt offshore wind project to be built out by the end of the decade. So all those are opportunities for us.
I also mentioned that we have a PPA between the University of Virginia and Dominion that has allowed Darden to achieve its carbon neutrality goals for the last year that we did that. Actually, I'm going to go to this side and then we'll come back to you over here.
I'm Julian Jordan from the Wharton School. Mark and Ann, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. And this question goes to you. As Corning is a player and an incumbent player in a fairly energy-intensive industry, such as manufacturing, how do you all view internally what would amount to be increased R&D expenditures in developing new and innovative products to make them more eco-friendly or address upcoming market trends? And how do you pair that increase in research and development with uncertain outcomes on the other side of that?
Yeah, so we've been dealing with that question for a long time. So Corning takes a long view on innovation. A lot of what we do takes time, and as we're looking to really optimize and invent, you'll see some shifts in the market in terms of timing, maybe coming faster, maybe moving slower. So there is a lot of uncertainty with that. What we try to do is keep a project going at a pace that matches that market opportunity, and we really don't get to a tough spending decision until we have to start doing real process work. So people in a lab is relatively inexpensive, keeping the ball moving forward, staying engaged with the customer. When we start having to make samples or enough samples for a customer to try to run like a pilot, that's where it all of a sudden it starts to really ramp up in expense. So we start to pay more attention to, okay, the classic things that you learn at business school on risk and reward. What's the one thing I need to figure out that's going to really advance me the most? So that's really how we weigh it. We look to do bottoms-up R&D. So just because Mark had a project last year, he's still got to come and prove that he needs that much spending this year, or can he do it with less? Or does he need more? And we roll up kind of a bottoms up and say, all right, here is it at the corporate load, it's $900 million this year. Does that feel right? What can we kind of give and take as we go through the year? So it's not a defined innovation portfolio. It's really more of a how do we flex as we set the budget and then go through the next 12 months. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Let's go to the right side here, or my right side.
Hi, I'm Madison from Radford University. This question is going to be more for Mark. Let me know if it's outside of the realm of Dominion Energy, but I still wanted to ask it anyways. So I'm doing research on electric vehicles and lithium mining and kind of those kind of impacts. Have you ever thought about looking at the environment around those lithium mining locations and seeing if you can help mitigate some of the environmental risks? Is that more outside of the realm of what Dominion Energy would do? And then I also have a second one. When you're talking about how you focus more on the batteries, have you ever thought about partnering with an auto company to maybe do something where, I know it's a little bit more difficult than just saying it, but almost like a refillable battery or something along those lines where you can almost like refill it and then you give it back to them. I know I've read a couple articles talking about that. It's a little bit more difficult, but I was just curious on your input.
So a couple things, taking the battery first. One thing we have looked at is, particularly with our school buses, where we will own the batteries, is that after about 8 years, their usefulness has declined enough where it can't power the bus, but we plan to remove them and use them as stationary batteries on the electric grid for probably another 10 years. In terms of the supply chain for batteries, we've looked closely. We've studied that just in terms of the current composition of the metals that make up lithium-ion batteries, where they're produced, where they're sourced, whether the cobalt that comes from Congo and what the labor practices are there, and then ultimately how do you dispose of them? Even if you've reused them for a second life, ultimately they have to be disposed. There's not a recycling market for lithium at this time. Potentially there is for cobalt. But what's going to happen in 20 years? Not just from the electric vehicle batteries, but also if we begin to use them for stationary storage at scale. A significant amounts of excavation will happen globally and in different locations, and then we'll have the batteries. So we look at those, and we'll look hard because we've experienced with our history of coal, with the byproduct of coal. I think safe to say most utilities are not going to repeat what happened there in terms of not planning ahead of time and not thinking through the longer term consequences.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious because I know some companies now, like you're saying, they're repurposing them for homes or different things. So I was just curious on that. But I definitely think, and I agree with you, that it's going to be a new growing market, and we're going to kind of see the trend of where that goes. So thank you.
Actually, I wanted to ask a question, put my economist hat on. We're obviously looking at a potential massive increase in the demand for batteries, both from vehicles and also, like you said, from storage for utility-grade batteries. How do you model that? How do you think about that potential, at least in the short term, shortage of supply given the demand for those batteries?
I mean, we look at it a lot. I mean, we can't really forecast any better than anyone else can. But I think that looking at where they are now, where they're produced, two potential uses with electrification of transportation and stationary storage, you might think that cars are going to win because it's the only alternative. For storage, there are other options out there in terms of the backup power with natural gas or things with pumped hydro facilities. There's an innovative thing that was in the Wall Street Journal last week. If you saw it, we've seen a presentation on it where it's a company that uses enormous bricks, like several tons, stacked 500 feet tall, and uses artificial intelligence with cranes that rotates them around up and down on like a pendulum almost, based on when energy is cheap or expensive. It's a complex project, but that's the type of thought when people around the world are starting to think about energy storage in ways that go back to just it's moving something when prices are low or where there's excess energy and releasing it when prices are high or energy is needed. Inventors are out there, and people are funding things and financing and testing and doing pilots of all sorts of potential things. So I think that you'll probably see transportation win out until there's enough battery supply for both. That's my view.
Interesting.
Thank you guys for coming here today. Alok Pandey from Penn State SMEAL. This question's for Mark. So I know Dominion's portfolio includes a section around nuclear power. And so my question is around where you see Dominion going with their nuclear portfolio and where you see nuclear power as part of the renewable energy, clean energy source going forward.
I think, our view, of course, we own, for those of you who don't know, we own and operate 7 nuclear units across the country, 4 in Virginia, 2 in Connecticut, 1 in South Carolina. It produces a significant amount of our carbon-free electricity. We expect to keep operating them. We hope to for an additional, we're seeking license extensions or pursuing those so that we would operate them for about, at the end, up to 80 years. It provides 40% of Virginia's power, for example, which is carbon-free. I don't think we see right now that without keeping existing nuclear running, we'll never, as a society, we're not going to meet carbon goals, let alone building new nuclear. But to keep the existing ones running, it's essential. I saw there was MIT did a survey, issued a report last year to cite it was that the nuclear, all the solar that we've built since the year 2000 in the United States, the carbon benefit of that solar has been offset by nuclear plants that have closed for economic reasons, which means that it's a treadmill. And when I say for economic reasons, it means that the nuclear plants, because they have high operating costs, couldn't compete against either natural gas or renewables that are operating with tax credits or subsidies. And yet it's carbon-free electricity. So from a policy standpoint, if the goal is decarbonization and zero carbon, you have to question whether policies that allow existing nuclears to shut makes a lot of sense. In our view, it doesn't. I think that longer term, small modular reactors, there's a lot of research going into those, and we've announced that we're working with some vendors to study those. It's a long-term process. And it will take a decade or more before there's a viable product, I think, that's available to the market.
Does Corning supply all the nuclear space, do you know?
No.
No, okay.
But I just had an idea.
A new innovation, all right.
Hello, my name is Aaron Capelli from Keenan Flagler. Question for Mark. So you mentioned earlier about renewable natural gas based off of farm products, so farm waste. I was wondering how that looks. Does that look like a collection of farms sort of making micro methane digesters that they sell at Energy to the Grid, or is it more of a larger central digester that the slurry is piped to that digester that's owned by Dominion, that's sold to the grid? And also, since you're the innovation officer, I think I can ask you this. So I worked in rural utility management in Alaska for water and sewer systems, and there are 3-cell sewage lagoons for human waste. Is there an opportunity for human waste to be turned into renewable methane? Just some questions.
Well, the short answer to anything that produces methane, there's an opportunity to capture it. It's depending on how cheaply you can do it and how efficiently you can process it to a usable form of energy. With the agriculture, like the hogs, which we partner with Smithfield Foods, they have independent producers who have their own hogs. It's essentially their lagoons, which we're creating. They had a problem with the odors. You cover them with what looks like an indoor tennis court cover, and you capture that, and it's treated and then injected into the pipeline. It goes through a process. It goes through a slight processing to make it pipeline quality gas. Cows are a little bit different because the cows, their methane is not as consolidated in one location as the hog waste is, and the dairies are different because they're indoors, and so you can capture it. So our first approach with cows is with the dairy farmers, but it's capturing the methane, which is a 25-to-1 win in terms of carbon if you can stop methane from being released unburned. So.
Hi, my name is Galen from Keenan Flagler, and Mark, I have a question for you. I'm curious if Dominion is looking at vehicle-to-grid as a potential solution to the duck curve problem, and if so, how the conversation around pricing those transactions is happening.
I'm sorry, is a solution to what problem?
The duck curve.
I think that our first foray will be the school buses, which are unique because the batteries are in a known location. In terms of the potential and theoretically exists for residential, private vehicles for vehicle to grid, I think we're a ways away practically from having the types of data knowledge that we know and having people comfortable in having their batteries drawn down. I think the first hurdle with electric vehicles is to get people comfortable with having an electric car and having the battery and not having range anxiety. I think over 10 years, 15 years, there's a potential. I think we're focused from vehicle to grid more on something like the school buses with fleets or other centralized locations where we know where the batteries are, we know when they're available, and then we can price that into the market.
Just to give a personal anecdote, I tend to think that range anxiety is being a little bit overblown. As an electric vehicle owner, the opportunity that you're actually, if you have a home that you can charge at, you're at basically a full tank all the time. So you're not actually running to get gas, except if you're going on a trip for greater than like 4 hours or so.
All right, thank you both for being here. My name is Megan from Duke's Fuqua School of Business. So building off of the nuclear question from a few minutes ago, Mark, have you all can begin to think about nuclear fusion, or is that very far off in the distance? What's Dominion's
I think
thought
we certainly follow it. We had an internal expo where we had a fusion company, an MIT spinoff, who's made another advance in terms of the possibility of fusion. Fusion's been on the horizon. It's kind of like fuel cells in terms of being a way to do it. But fuel cells work. Fusion's not there, but it's possible. I mean, at some point in the future, someone will achieve it, and that will be the disruption. But I tell our folks, you can't wait for that to happen. In the meantime, we've got all these things that can reduce carbon 2%, 3%. As you go along, you can't wait for the home run, for the grand slam. We do what we can do now.
Thank you.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, my name's Liz. I'm with Keenan Flagler. I have a question about jumping back to the methane capture. How do you separate yourself from the public opinion and environmental risk associated with CAFOs and Smithfield when you are implementing methane capture at hog lagoons?
I think we view it as we're helping, we're creating wins. We're helping them solve a problem. but we're also benefiting our own customers. I think that the reaction that we got from the public perception to the announcement with Smithfield was one of the most well-received business initiatives that we've ever launched. It was, I think it caught us up by surprise how much positive attention it cost, and people were just intrigued by the whole concept. So I think that it's the type of thing where if you're changing directions and you've got multiple parties willing to change directions and do things that benefit everybody, it's willing to take a risk.
Thank you.
So I want to ask one last question of both of you. Again, we have a collection of very talented MBAs from many different schools here with us today. The topic, again, is kind of innovation here, kind of across the value chain. What recommendations would you give them as they think about their careers of where they can have impact as it relates to climate change? Anne, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so I think, for a company like Corning, if you're interested in industry, we're a hardcore manufacturing company. It takes energy to melt glass and fire ceramics. It's really, I would just parallel what Wendy said in terms of looking for, where can I have an impact in terms of making it more efficient. Even in gasoline combustion engines, even in the natural gas that we use in our tanks for melting, it's not 100% efficient. What are cars today, like 18% efficient like that? So there's so much opportunity to improve our carbon footprint. We use water when we make glass, for example, too. So I think, wherever you choose to go, or if you have a passion towards doing something about impacting climate change, in a company like Corning, that there's just boatloads of opportunity. And I think so then that would be number one, and then number two, kind of making sure that you stay within the rails of the company that you're at. So, what were you hired to do, and then how can you make it even better from a personal perspective in terms of what you want to do to impact the climate and the operating environment that you're in.
Great. Mark?
I would say first, know the full scope of the business, and don't just focus on, for instance, electricity needs to be more renewable. Well, what is the entire process from delivery to transportation? Where can you make a difference? What is your company doing at every step of the equation, from travel to manufacturing? How do you get your goods to market? What's your packaging? And what's the production level there? And I think that the other one, which I would say is important, is just to always start everything from the standpoint of a business case. Even if that business case relies on the fact that you're going to have a positive public reaction versus dollars and cents. But in many cases, approach it just like you would anything else, because the business case can be made for many of these initiatives. Even if it may not be something that's accretive in year one, maybe you've got a business case on something that says, look, here's what we can do, and in 3 years, if these factors are right, we will look like geniuses, and here's the business case for it. You may be wrong, you've got to factor that in, but you don't go out, approach it just like you would any other business case, and that's the way you're going to earn the respect and be able to advance ideas within the company.
Wonderful. Let's join in thanking them for their time with us. So we're going to exit off here. So thank you.